So Sarah, I guess I'll start with just talking about the topic of the day, which is or not Oregon DOJ, but the U.S. DOJ designating Portland as a anarchist jurisdiction.
Yeah.
What do you think of that, and also the president and the president's administration's fascination with Portland, for lack of a better way to describe it, over the last couple of months in particular?
He's such a bully. I mean, it's easy to pick on a place like Portland, right? We're moderately sized, ostensibly progressive in our reputation and our aspirations. We've come together around community concerns for a very long time, and picking on Portland is pretty easy when you think about it. The way that the right wing, the white nationalists, Patriot Prayer, and Proud Boys have really set their sights on us. It's not surprising that their top dog, if you will, had also decided to follow that lead and pick on a city like Portland. It doesn't please me. It's outsized attention for a city like ours, and we don't really have the capacity to fight him back if he puts the full power of that government on us, as we saw before, right, with the quote-unquote federal occupation. So it's one of the reasons why I've been so committed to building community power in Portland, really as the first responder when things like this happen. Ultimately, I think it's our community conviviality and even joyfulness as a city that threatens what he's all about most. Because if you have healthy, connected communities, then a lot of the things that the people he espouses, they're just irrelevant. It's a circus. There's no merit for the bigotry or the toxic masculinity or the hatred that he's purveying. So it's not disappointing, but not surprising.
I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about what it's been like for you these past couple of months navigating through the pandemic and running for mayor for a second time. This experience is obviously different from 2016. And so I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, that's a fun question. Thanks for asking me. Wow. We never predicted back when we launched this last July that this is what it would be like. But there's a beauty to it in terms of I had put together a very iconoclastic team. I had gotten some pushback when I hired Gregory McKelvey as my campaign director, for example. The local media said, Sarah hires local Black Lives Matter activists to power her campaign. And now look how that's helping me, that he's able to bring his expertise in that activist space to help me navigate the complexity there. My deputy director was the CTO for Pickathon. So he was able, when we hit COVID, and it was we had to call for the shelter in place. We called for that, I think, around March 12th on our campaign based on our briefings. And the following weekend, we were about to deploy our ground game that was including knocking on 28,000 doors as part of we had built the entire campaign to be able to deploy that capacity. We could do zero of it. So because he brought this background in production and entertainment and a network of expertise there, we were able to transform the campaign to all virtual within 4 weeks, and we're fully back in the game. And that's, I believe, the secret to why we made it through the primary. Even though we are fighting against a lot of obstacles in terms of name recognition, or, when you're not the incumbent, not being able to talk to voters is really challenging. Ultimately, though, community coming together to work on things is the basis of what I'm arguing we need to be doing more of for our problem solving anyway. So we're pretty adaptable. We moved out of office space in Central East Side. We said, a conference room isn't going to do us any good during COVID. So we got our friends to post us up in their garage, our friends from the City Repair Project, and now we have people who come through. You can't see it here, but there's a garage door, and people ride through and pick up materials and stay safely distanced, and we can go across to the park and have outdoor meetings 6 feet apart, and we do the best that we can.
Well, can you briefly tell me about how many people you guys have been able to reach? I know you just mentioned a little while ago about how, once COVID happened, door knocking was out of the window, but I know you guys have been doing phone banks and texting. So can you talk a little bit more about
I can even
that?
call Dylan if you want the top number. Hey, Dylan. We are working on. There's some weeks, like last week, we texted 35,000 people. We're doing phone calls between 1,500 and 10,000, depending on what the plan for that week is and how we're deploying our resources. We're about to deploy a pretty intense digital advertising, television, broadcast, and cable, as well as phone banking to get out the vote, and some direct mail as well. We'll be doing all of that to reach voters. The lawn signs, we have thousands. I don't even know the number. There's a lot, and we've put them down many times. So there's a lot of lawn signs out in the world, and posters and masks and T-shirts. It's just really been about trying to engage people around a message that's hopeful and optimistic. People are a little despairing right now. They're feeling overwhelmed by the amount that they have to deal with. I felt it especially in the fires last week with the smoke. I felt like people were going to break. So we're using those contacts with voters. The phone calls, they sometimes become more community outreach than voter outreach. You hit a lot of elders who are, you may be the first person that they've talked to. And so our folks are spending a lot more time on the phones than you would in a historic, a more, I don't even know what you call it now, normal. I don't think there's any normal, but traditionally you would have spent just a few minutes on the phone with each voter, and sometimes they'll be on the phone maybe 20, 30 minutes even. So it's intense, voter contact for sure, but we're working the numbers. I mean, that's always been the plan, was just to reach as many voters as possible to try and get that vote, circling that name next to Sarah in November.
You've talked about repeatedly over the last couple of months of the current administration and how they failed the city, in your opinion. Can you talk about what you feel are the biggest key missteps of Mayor Ted Wheeler over the last 4 years?
He's the one who said he failed. He went on Fox and he said, "I'm sorry, I've tried to do too much. I've gone it alone. I've failed." And that was actually good to hear him admit that, because so many of us, it wasn't just me, it's quite a chorus of us who were a little frustrated from the jump with him in terms of how are we going to solve our most pressing problems if we don't build coalitions and then really invest in those relationships over time to work on some of our more intractable things, right? You think about the crisis of homelessness, you think about the crisis of gentrification and displacement, you think about the climate crisis, the staggering inequality here, especially geographically between East Portland and the rest of the city, and you just haven't seen a vision. So when you don't have a clear vision of what we're trying to get to, things become scattershot and ad hoc, right? You can put this investment here or that investment there and say, oh, I've created X number of jobs or prevented X number of people from being evicted. But it's not part of a comprehensive solution. Mayor Hales came in 2015, declared a housing state of emergency, but no one subsequently ever came up with a strategic plan to end it. I don't know how you expect to end it if you don't have a good understanding of what you're trying to accomplish, in what time frame, and what resources you'll put behind that. Similar with policing, I wrote an op-ed piece with Elliot Young of PSEP 18 months ago now, calling to make Commissioner Joanne Hardesty the police bureau commissioner so that we can make a faster progress. And so it's the lack of substantive process that I think finds our crises that we're in now even more heavy, because we should have been doing more when we were affluent and able, if you will, in one of our highest prosperity times as a city. And now we're in deep crisis, and it's worse than it needs to be. Ultimately, it's a failure to build hearty relationships. What is the working relationship with Commissioner or Chair Kafori and the joint office and the county? What is the relationship with the state, and how we're working with our friends in the legislature and the governor's office to co-create solutions? You don't see a lot of that. You see a lot of tension. So it seems like the failure to create those relationships in a meaningful way and invest in them is a big gap in what he should have been able to accomplish, or at least he promised us he would bring his background from the county and from the state to be able to build those bridges effortlessly, was I guess what we assumed he was committing to. And then acting on climate change with urgency. For me, this isn't something that we can just take lightly. when I'm talking with young people, they feel their futures hang in the balance. Our communities already, as you're seeing with the wildfire season, we know it's going to be our least affluent neighbors who are harmed first and worst in times of crisis, climate crisis, and that's going to keep happening summer after summer. So if we're not investing in those future-oriented jobs where we're crafting the just transition off the fossil fuel economy into the green economy, I just don't know how we're going to survive as a city. And COVID is laying that bare too. We're going to have to make some intense public investments if we want to recover with any meaningful urgency or equity in that undertaking, I think.
You mentioned that you have been in favor of Commissioner Hardesty overseeing the police bureau, and you've said it recently, I believe, on social media and other platforms as well. Why are you in favor of that?
There are a few reasons. One, when I'm out and I hear people protesting, they're calling for that. And so when you think about the fact that we're in, I don't even know, 103, 104th day of protests now, and you ask yourself, if these have become protests about the night before, we have to stop the cycle. And what are the largest signifiers that we could give to that part of the public that we are engaged in change making with them? If they're calling for Commissioner Hardesty to be made police commissioner, that seems to me like that would be a very abrupt, significant signifier that we're serious about communicating differently and engaging differently with them. Apart from the community calls for that, my argument 18 months ago was that we have a trust problem in our city. There's not a great deal of trust between the Portland police and the wider community. And so putting someone like Commissioner Hardesty, who comes from a background of police reform that's more radical, that's a little bit more community-oriented and progressive and with a lens to racial justice, is how she's going to be able to lead us with her 30 years of concrete experience in the community, but also, again, demonstrating a different kind of leadership. So she can bring a different voice to that. And ultimately, if you're the mayor, then what you've got is a different position where you're not the police commissioner, someone else is. So you can work on budgets and policies and other reforms in tandem to her. That combination of mayor and police commissioner is a lot. So trusting her and trusting the community voice that trusts her, I think would be two steps through one single action that could be made pretty immediately, and it's budget neutral too. I mean, it's a revenue neutral step where, again, I don't know how doing the same thing day after day after day and thinking that outcomes are going to be different is a sane position. So it's a dramatic critical juncture, I guess you call it. What do they call it now? Disruption. It's a disruptive move, but hopefully for the better.
If you won the election in 2016, how do you think Portland would have been different under your oversight than the last 4 years?
Two ways are pretty dramatic and I think apparent. One of the things that I proposed in 2016 that I'm still proposing is a officer of small business and entrepreneurship right in the mayor's office. That person would be responsible for coordinating all of the various activities going on in our city and even around the region to make sure that all of the resources available to our small business community especially were coordinated. And that's just not capital resources, but that's also technical assistance. And thinking about what that means then to set up the data systems so that we're tracking impact. Again, it's this notion that it's not enough to just invest. When you don't have a strategy behind your investments, it's hard to make market progress over time. And what we really need to show is that we're creating increased opportunity for minority entrepreneurship, for our BIPOC business owners, for our community corridors and neighborhood businesses, that the downtown businesses are cooperating, I guess I would say, and understanding their role as regional leaders and leading on conversations like that, that's where having that person who is managing those relationships would be so helpful at this critical time. I understand that Prosper Portland and the mayor have been working hard in the wake of COVID, but imagine if those people were in place and those relationships and those systems in place prior to COVID. We would have a lot greater efficiency, in my opinion, with regard to how we were spending those valuable dollars now, and also making sure that we're having the impact and reaching the community members that we needed to be reaching. So that's one. The other one, I think, has to do with some of the issues. It's probably one of the least sexy parts of my platform, but it's my good government plan. You know, we talk about my Green New Deal and the Housing for All and Rethinking Public Safety, which are all pretty dramatic, progressive policy suites, if you will. But the good government plan is really at the heart of a lot of this. And it has to do with how do we engage each other in a democracy? And how do we come together in a participatory model of governance that makes people feel included, that makes sure that we're making decisions that reflect the health and well-being of all Portlanders, not just a vocal minority. Some of the missteps, I think, in the Office of Civic Life that Commissioner Udaley encountered with the backlash with regard to the code change, what I had proposed was an Office of Community Resilience, where we brought a lot of bureaus together to think about economic development, disaster preparedness, civic engagement under this umbrella of resilient communities and how they're organized. And the Rockefeller Foundation was actually giving cities grants at the time to even hire a chief resiliency officer for the city. There were 100 cities that got to be included in that. And I thought, you know, Portland is such a model city. Surely if we'd applied for that, I'm almost positive that we would have gotten one. So there was opportunities to then join that global network of cities looking at resiliency models. And I feel, again, if we had invested in that back then, look at where we'd be for COVID. I'm looking around at all the community capacity where I see people who from the beginning have been making hand sanitizer, feeding the homeless with increased urgency, setting up safety hubs, and deploying whatever we're able to pull together ad hoc. And imagine if our whole city were already mobilized around disaster preparedness, and every neighborhood emergency team and neighborhood association was already facing in a direction where collaboration and communication and inclusive community building was at the core, not because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the essential thing to do, right? When you're prepared for a disaster, every neighbor on your block is ready if that earthquake hits, regardless of what language they speak, their nation of origin, their political affiliation, their sexual orientation, right? That, if we all have to be ready for the big one. To me, looking at something like that brings us all together, or schools, right? Schools are a part of that. Faith-based organizations are all a part of that. I believe that we would be in better shape for the crises that we're currently facing. And I also don't know that we would be as under threat potentially, because we would have a greater capacity for dialogue through those investments. Right now, a lot of what divides us is an inability to communicate, not an inability to share values. So those are two pretty concrete examples, I think, of things that I proposed in 2016. I'll give you one more because it's a good one. The Community Safety Hub, those the C3PO, those emergency tent encampments that are underneath the Hawthorne Bridge now that came online due to COVID. I proposed those back in 2016 as an emergency solution to the homelessness crisis, because that was a best practice that I had heard out of people in the community that they wanted to see more of, because they found them cost effective, trauma informed, and when certain affinity groups are able to co-locate, there's a lot of synergies there in terms of support and what people need to survive and actually work to get out of living on the streets and into permanent housing. So I would have brought those online far sooner, because I think they're effective, they're cost effective and compassionate solution to what, as opposed to people living in tents, on the sidewalk.
Demonstrators and community leaders have been calling for Mayor Wheeler to resign. Do you agree? Do you think he should resign?
Well, I mean, my campaign is essentially a one-person campaign to get him out of office. So if he wanted to make that easier on me, I wouldn't complain. Ultimately, I believe in democracy. I do believe in protest. I'm disappointed that I get conflicted, right? As a resident of Portland, I want my mayor to succeed. Me, as a resident of Portland, I want my mayor to not have lost the faith of the people. I want my mayor to be able to solve problems and rise to the occasion, if you will. But the complete lack of trust and faith in him right now from all corners of the city has us a bit of a spinning our wheels, if you will, where it feels like we can't get out of it for lack of trying. It's not that there's not energy or power behind it, but we're just spinning and spinning. And in part, I think that's what drives people's call for him to resign, because, the leadership would be putting those 2x4s under those wheels and getting us out of the mud, and he's just not been able to do it. So I'm conflicted. As a candidate, I look forward to winning an election and becoming the next mayor and putting my different ideas into practice, but I really want Portland to be doing better now.
I wanted to see if I wanted to give you a chance to respond to the election violation complaint filed by Jules Bailey, who finished second in 2016 mayoral race. He's claiming that you may be trying to mislead voters with the PhD, ABD, and what do you think of that, and why did you feel it was important to put that on your voters pamphlet?
Can you, is there a volume to eye rolling that will go on here? The voters are so tired of this political gamesmanship. It's clearly an attempt of the opposition to undermine the legitimacy of my campaign and my trustworthiness. ABD is precisely and accurately the level of education I have achieved. Everyone knows. I'm sorry that Mr. Bailey doesn't know how to use Google, but if you Google ABD, it means all but dissertation. I have checked every box in the degree requirements except that, and it's actually putting that makes it precise. If I had just put PhD, then that would have been imprecise and inaccurate. Putting ABD means this is exactly where I am, and for anybody who's been in that position, it's an albatross. It's not a great feeling to not be finished with your degree, but I was clear, explicit, and I'm sorry that he can't use Google, but it's really a waste of everyone's time.
Why put it in if you haven't gotten the degree yet?
Because that's years and years of work and study and comprehensive exams and colloquium and proposals that I have completed. And that topic is urban planning, urban theory, and sustainable cities. So that's not irrelevant to the task at hand. My area of expertise is studying how to make cities sustainable for the future. So if I didn't include that, then that doesn't indicate my actual level of study. And I have achieved that part. So putting it in, again, is accurate and precise with regard to what level of education I've actually attained.
And you think that's more appropriate than, seeking PhD or anything along those lines?
Well, yeah, again, it's the term that people use to describe it. So if you Google it, that's what it means.
You've got a lot of very detailed plans about what you want to do if you're elected as mayor. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your immediate plans would be if you were elected over your first 3 months. What are specific plans that you hope to put into place, and how do you think, what's the path to get there?
Yeah, that first 100 days plan, I'm glad you asked me about it, because we're going to be releasing it. We're hammering it out now with our steering committee and our advisors. It's important. I think we need to balance. I heard a great saying, there's slow roast solutions and there are microwave solutions, and the people of Portland need me to microwave them solutions on day one and in the first even week of my administration. You can't laugh during serious answers like that. It's sorry. A good analogy. I thought it was a good analogy. I'm sorry. It's all good. It's a good one. So, there's this notion that first 100 days really is those microwavable solutions that are going to help us, get people invested in the administration, building trust in the administration. A lot of those will come on the front of public safety, right? So that commitment to make Commissioner Hardesty police commissioner, that can happen on day one. The moratorium on the sweeps, I think, is important, because what we've seen over time is that we put a lot of money into moving people from one end of the block to the other without a good answer for what happens on the other end of that displacement. And I think that money would be better spent, again, putting people into transitional villages, emergency shelters, and things like that, as opposed to just sweeping indiscriminately. I think anti-displacement should apply to everyone in Portland as something that we need to prioritize. So that's another thing. Making investments in community safety hubs. I'm quite worried about this winter. I'm worried about the economic deprivation that people are still going to be facing under COVID. Our federal government cannot get its act together. We're watching right now in the wake of the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg that they're not even focused on more economic stimulus for the people as they engage in this political battle over the next Supreme Court nomination. So where does that leave Portlanders facing potentially eviction if and when that moratorium lifts? With regard to food security, access to childcare, or even the peer support, I'm actually worried about people's mental health. Meanwhile, we're not using all of our buildings, whether they're schools or community centers, at maximum capacity. So is there some way to turn those temporarily into safety areas for people when they need resources, as opposed to having all of our community aid set up underneath, pop-up tents all over the city? Because what we saw last week in the wildfires, I believe we're going to need more of in sustained capacity. Even things like access to restrooms and showers are going to be important for people experiencing homelessness. A safe sleep zone so people can get in from the elements and make sure that they're sleeping where they're not going to freeze outside. I'm praying that will be a mild winter. So that's one part of where we can start immediately. Gun violence prevention, right? We can't look at things like the drawing down of the GVRT or the SROs. People talk a lot about defund the police, but I really believe that you have to talk about it in terms of reallocation. So if we're going to draw down the militarized or highly criminal justice oriented interventions in public safety, then what will we invest in on the other side of that? I want to see us looking upstream. That Office of Youth Violence Prevention is pretty cop centric and cop heavy. And what I've heard, I've convened a group of youth actually who are March for Our Lives and other organizations around Oregon to advise on gun violence prevention. And they say there are a few things that we could do immediately. So enforcing the gun legislation already on the books, which we haven't seen Portland mayors really vocal or committed to doing in partnership with our friends at the county, at Multnomah County. But then also these upstream interventions that aren't just happening when the gun violence is either about to happen or after the fact, but are there things we could do to prevent evictions and gentrification and to shore up schools so that we don't have high school turnover? Because we know that gun violence and community disruption go hand in hand. So I really want us to take this opportunity, even though again it's coming from a very tragic situation of this intensified gun violence. August was like our highest month in like 30 years or something like that, if I understand it correctly. So what does it mean for us to look upstream, to take this as a moment, not to just say defund the police or get rid of GVRT, but to make serious investments in the upstream health of communities so that they're more, again, resilient, not to over rely on that word, but they're more resilient against this kind of violence.
And speaking of defunding the police, protesters and community leaders have made several demands over the last few months, particularly rerouting $50 million from the Portland police budget directly to Black and brown communities in Portland. Are those initiatives that you agree with? And if not, why not? And if so, how does the city get there?
It's such an important question. We, as a community, have failed to keep everyone safe here. And we need to acknowledge that there are so many people right now who cannot call any number, 211, 311, 911, whatever it is, and feel like whatever they're afraid of in that moment, that there's going to be something on the other end of that phone call that suddenly helps them feel safe. It's the biggest failing, I believe, for us as a community and as a society and as a city right now. How you address that is what our community partners in, say, PALF and Unite Oregon have been looking at for a very long time, even State of Black Oregon from the Urban League at the state level, and saying this is what we need to invest in instead of militarized policing in our schools, in our communities, in our streets. And they have done that legwork. And so when they came in that last budget cycle and talked about that $50 million, I was pretty disappointed to see it dismissed somewhat out of hand as an unreasonable number or being pulled out of thin air. It wasn't pulled out of thin air. It was developed over time through community input and through the research and inquiry of these community organizations, and that's how they arrived at a plan, if you will. And so I supported them, and I testified on behalf of that number at City Council when the budget process came up. And people say, "Well, what will your number be if and when you're mayor?" And I say I would again listen to community organizations like that and actually convene them with intention in a more participatory process to say, hey, let's hammer out a plan for this budget cycle, certainly, but then for the next 4, 5, 6 years in terms of what is the transition away from this heavily militarized police presence that we've created over decades to the future of public safety that you want to see. And in fact, we were thinking about that prior to George Floyd's tragic death with the Rethinking Public Safety Plan. So there is a sustained commitment on the part of my campaign to look at that drawdown in that militarized part of the budget. Did I answer the question that you asked?
I guess maybe I should ask more directly.
Yeah.
You said that you support several different community groups that have called for 50 million, but if you were elected, is that the number that you would stick to, a $50 million rerouting of police budget funds to other initiatives, or is it something else? Do you feel like it's too much?
I feel like my process would be the same way I arrived at supporting them in the last budget cycle, is bringing them together to find out what's the number for the next budget cycle.
What if it's 50 million?
If they say it's 50 million and they have a clear plan for how they want that money reallocated into effective solutions that they believe are going to help keep their communities safe, then I think we should listen to them on that front, because especially, we have to understand that there are too many people here who don't feel safe right now. And so if the community is telling us that they need something to feel safe, we need to hear that call. And we need to take the risk, if you will, of trying something differently. No cities across the U.S. have done this before, right? What we're upending is systems that are centuries old. And carving out new ground is going to be challenging. But if any place can do it, it's Portland. We're known as a civic innovator. We're known as a policy innovator. And I think that this is the kind of place where, through participatory budgeting, good community coalitions, and a robust community conversation about rethinking public safety, again, which is what I proposed in my roadmap there, is how we're going to come up with what that number would look like for the community. It's very participatory, and ultimately I support participatory budgeting writ large, along the lines of what is suggested by the coalition that's working on that here in Oregon right now. There's the grapes.
Is that one of the grapes?
Ask and you shall receive, Everton. It's raining grapes at Sarah 2020 headquarters. But yeah, so that would be my approach. It's definitely going to be procedural, where I follow that roadmap in making that decision.
So there have been political pundits who have said that the write-in campaign for Teresa Rayford may take away votes from you. So I wanted to get what's your perspective on that, and what do you think of the support for her write-in campaign?
Oh, I understand that people are interested in someone with her track record on gun violence, someone with her ties to community. They would love to see her in a position of leadership in the city, elected leadership, and I respect that immensely. I disagree with her on many policies. It's one reason I ran against her, especially housing. I don't think she's particularly progressive on housing. I thought her housing policies, if and when you could find them, were particularly regressive, and I didn't share them. But ultimately, there are 2 names on the ballot this November, mine and Ted Wheeler's, and I don't know that by the time we get to November, many people will want to write in. There have been multiple write-in campaigns talked about, so whether or not that's something that gets traction, I don't know. We're just working really hard to stay focused on our opponent, who we see as the incumbent mayor, and the status quo largely of 4 more years of this not being a very good idea. So I hope we make the case effectively to people that I'll be a trustworthy leader who represents their values and their vision for the future of Portland, and that people can get behind me and vote for me in November.
Yeah, I spoke to Mayor Wheeler. I think it was early this month. What is time nowadays, right?
Yeah.
Everything blurs together.
What are weekends? What are months?
But I spoke to the mayor, and he criticized you particularly because he felt that you haven't come out strongly enough, in his view, on violence that happens during protests. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Do you agree? Well, and what do you think about what happens during protests?
I actually wrote an op-ed to the Oregonian. I think they put it in because I was unhappy with that assertion. I have it in writing that I have been against violence at protests as early as May 31st, which was the first weekend. And I have consistently said that violence is wrong no matter who does it. But the distinction is my unwillingness to call graffiti violence and my unwillingness to call vandalism violence, when what we really know is violence is bodily harm. And my focus has consistently been on making sure that we're not accepting police violence, right? When we talk about deploying tear gas, munitions, rubber bullets into crowds, that is indiscriminate violence against large groups of people, the majority of whom are not engaged in any illegal activity at all. And further, it comes down to equal enforcement of the law. And I've talked about this as well, and it's something that I don't get credit for. I've always called for equal enforcement of the law, but what we're not seeing is when you have multiple groups, Black Lives Matter demonstrators on one side and the Patriot Prayer or Proud Boys on the other. From my firsthand experience and the accounts of people like me who go to protests, the police are more sympathetic to the white nationalists than they are to the Black Lives Matter activists. And I think that's been borne out largely in even some of the work done by your newspaper in terms of who gets arrested at protests. The disproportionate arrests of BIPOC protesters. What does it mean in terms of when people come wielding guns openly and pointing them at people in crowds? Are arrests made? When people come and they're using large vehicles to run through crowds of pedestrian, are arrests made? Right? Where are some people held accountable for violence and what constitutes violence and why seems to be disproportionately enforced in our city? And I've been careful too, and it brings us back to the beginning of our conversation about Donald Trump, because ultimately, if you are not steadfast in your understanding that white nationalism is essentially a disease on our society and that we need to eradicate it at all costs, you cannot come to that conversation of there are good people on both sides, that Black Lives Matter demonstrators are good people, and also white nationalists who would like to eliminate Black Lives Matter demonstrators are good people. And so I have consistently stood on the side of the people who are fighting for justice, who are fighting for equity, who are fighting for inclusion in a pluralist society, against people who would espouse bigotry and hate and come here to incite riots and come here to have a society where only a few, based on genetics, would survive. It's not the future of our city, and it's not, I believe, the future of our country. And so you have to make a distinction clearly, and that's why I'm very vocal in my support of the Black Lives Matter demonstrators on that front.
What would be your plan? I mean, as you know, I think there's another right-wing rally coming up, I think maybe this weekend. What would be your approach to handling the rally and then the counter demonstrations that are going to come with it?
This is where my experience actually at demonstrations gives me greater insight, I believe, than the incumbent in terms of what an appropriate solution is. You know, he harkens back to that August 17th situation where he convened a photo op in the days prior showing a community coalition. But as someone who was there on the ground that day, the people who were there from his shop, if you will, were law enforcement. Right? The response is always added law enforcement. Who are our partners in law enforcement? Who are law enforcement? And again, as I said to you, I have not seen law enforcement equitably upholding the law, if you will. And so if that is the case, and if it is the case that we have seen police brutality be the response to protests about police brutality, and yet we see white nationalists and white supremacists coming to town as if the police are almost an escort for them to arrive safely and leave safely, I would actually like to see less law enforcement there and more support of community engagement, more support of convivial spectacle, right? What would it mean for us to follow almost the vortex model, where we're throwing community parties and it was teach-ins around everyday anti-fascism and an inclusive society and anti-racism trainings and mutual aid trainings and how you can become a part of like whatever a community fair even. How do you invest in pro-social activity that's going to get your people engaged in a meaningful way? Creating outcomes that you want to see when we have, again, invested time and again in law enforcement only to see the outcomes not be positive. And so you have to try something new. I also think there are simple innovations. What would it mean for us to make downtown car-free that day? Right? We talk about things like, a car-free downtown. Well, you could try it for one day. Come on in. You're fine. You could try it for one day, and I guess she's going to go around. There are multiple entrances. You could try it for one day, and it could be an experiment. Make the transit free that day, or work on free bike share that day, so that you had people moving around on foot and on bicycle. But what wouldn't be here? Well, those big trucks, right? That people are using as weapons we've seen in demonstrations all around the U.S. And that's not. Calling for a car-free day is unconstitutional, right? So there's a lot of creative solutions that if you were really working with community, I believe we could deploy more effectively to let these folks know that that kind of bigotry and hatred is not welcome here. But I don't know that we've been operating with maximum creativity on this front.
How would you enforce a car-free day in an area like downtown, and also if you have a situation where you don't have police around or responding to a big demonstration, which I think is what you mentioned at first, are you concerned of a situation happening like the shooting from a few weeks ago, or another a protester pulling out a gun? That's what happened with a right-wing activist who pulled out a gun during a protest. Are you concerned? Do you have public safety concerns if you were to limit the amount of police who were to be at these demonstrations?
But the police were there and those things happened. They didn't solve either one of them. So I don't know, again, that the answer is more law enforcement if we can't count on equal enforcement of the law. We saw it with the vigilantes even during the wildfires, right? In terms of who gets to get away with doing things outside the law and who doesn't, especially in real time and or after the fact. The way you enforce a car-free downtown is the same way you do a block party. We do it all the time. I mean, Portland's a magnificently transportation-forward city. We know how to throw a block party better than just about any city in the United States, in my opinion. It's one thing we're known for. So how we wouldn't be able to pull off a block party in a small part of our city, I believe that's well within our capacity, especially if we brought all of City Council and our various bureaus together in creative ways to do that. And it would ultimately, I believe, be cheaper in the long run because we're spending a lot of money on tear gas and police overtime and rubber bullets and things like that. They're very expensive. A few barricades with flashing lights are a lot different proposition, I think, in terms of investment. You get to put those back in the storage unit at the end of the day. So.
Speaking of that, of the tear gas, and I mean, Mayor Wheeler recently announced that he was banning the police bureau from using tear gas.
CS gas.
CS gas, thank you. CS gas in particular. Do you feel that goes far enough?
Well, it took him long enough. It took him about 100 days, I think, to be able to call for that. Even though the community was calling for it long before. Again, it's an indiscriminate weapon used against many innocent people. I have heard so many people, especially on social media, downtown, a high-density neighborhood with a lot of low-income and elderly people. You've got it in neighborhoods like Northeast Portland, East Portland by Ventura Park there, where the people in their homes at night were experiencing this. That is unacceptable. And so, yes, he should have called for it much sooner. But again, we have to ask ourselves if doing the same thing night after night is the appropriate response, when really it's the definition of insanity to keep doing the same thing again and again and expect a different outcome. I think we have to break that cycle of violence by making some pretty serious commitments to listening to the community concerns and then coming up with a public safety plan to address them.
I'll switch gears to my next question
Okay.
a little bit. What do you make of the city's coronavirus response for residents?
Well, that's a big question.
I'll break it down a little bit.
Yeah.
What do you think the city has done well, and what are things that you think the city needs to improve on, that you would improve on if you were elected as mayor?
Again, it's this notion of what is the community capacity. I do believe that we're deploying resources as extensively as we have them, as best as we can. I would have a more coordinated model because of those two examples I gave early in our conversation with regard to small business and entrepreneurship, central hub in my office, but also the notion of community resilience and the capacity that we would have there, so that we could be deploying our dollars more efficiently and more effectively. They have worked hard to meet the needs of small business, and I appreciate that. They have foregrounded, I believe, community businesses and corridors and BIPOC business owners, and not over-focused on the downtown core. So it seems like the leadership out of Prosper Portland has had its intentions pointed in the right direction. But again, without a concerted plan, it becomes all very scattershot, and I would like to be more strategic on those fronts. And again, making sure that community capacity is maximized, so making it as easy as possible for us to be turning our auditoriums and community centers and even parks into these safety hubs where people could get food boxes and things like that, so it's not left on individuals or groups, small groups of individuals, to set up something like that. But can we make it easier through centralized coordination and communications? You know, one of the things that we had to build almost from scratch was a way to communicate with the public on this. If you think about, when was the last time you got an all-city text? I think it was when they put the curfew in on us. And everyone was like, what? What are you talking about? We don't use that functionality when we're saying, hey, everybody, like, let's all get out. We all need to volunteer on Saturday to clean this up. Everybody go to your nearest business district if you can and go help. Like, why are we not doing that? Portlanders love to help. And in fact, what I hear from talking to voters is, why do I not know where to go to help? So really getting that community capacity, so that community is our first responder, and that the social cohesion is ultimately our basis, right, of how we're going to prosper in the future, is what we need to be investing in right now.
Two more questions for
Okay.
you. So
Keep an eye on time.
the city, I want to say back in April or May, really advocated for a rent and mortgage forgiveness program. They were calling for state and federal officials to really consider that.
Yeah.
They've since given up on that. The mayor said recently that there just isn't enough interest from the state and federal level to really pass it through. And so they've really been hammering rent assistance. Do you feel like that is the right way to go, or do you feel like the city should still go after trying to get rent and mortgage forgiveness?
I'm worried about some of the smaller landlords, right? If we maintain the eviction moratorium. Hi, Greg. If we maintain the eviction moratorium, then we're going to have to be careful about what happens to those folks who have to start paying their mortgages again, right? And I always think about, how can we increase our bargaining power locally so that we have the greatest leverage against Wall Street? Ultimately, that's my biggest concern. Because when you think about who owns the rental properties in our city, you've got, some of them are the mom and pop shops, and then some of them are the larger brokerage firms and Wall Street interests who are posting record-breaking profits for some reason, even in the middle of an economic crisis. So my thought would be, how do we make sure that we're actually holding those big Wall Street investors the ones that are left holding the bag, as opposed to our either small landlords, mom and pop shops, small business owners, on that front, and then ultimately renters accountable. It's about, can we continue to negotiate to push responsibility up the chain? I don't know that we're in that position as a city right now, but we need to focus on that being the basis of how we're going to have this conversation in the future, because as the mayor of Portland, my job is to protect the people of Portland, not Wall Street. And so discerning between those groups of people who own real estate in our city is a pretty important one. Also, I think making sure that none of my city employees are engaged in evictions, right? What does it mean to make sure that they're not actively displacing people in the middle of a crisis until we have this worked out? Because frankly, not only is it immoral, it's going to be way too expensive. We know the costs of tipping people into homelessness. Once people end up homeless, it's so hard to get them housed again. So doing everything we can to keep people housed is going to be pretty important. But also some negotiating power. Do we need to think about how can we collectively start to bargain our way through some of these buyouts, if you will, of late payment buyouts and things like that? We should be able to work, I hope, with the state on that. We do have a lot of housing allies in the Oregon legislature who I don't think want to see so many people displaced in our city either.
And my last question is there anything that I haven't asked that you want to mention or talk about?
I want to talk about the power of this publicly financed campaign. It's something that doesn't get talked a lot about, because they'll say, why are you running for mayor? You haven't held elective office before. What qualifies you to be our mayor if you haven't held elective office before? But ultimately, because I bring a unique skill set with my background in small business, as a mom, as someone who understands urban policy both locally and globally, I'm really well equipped to serve the city right now. But under traditional ways that people fund campaigns, I wouldn't necessarily be perceived that way. But because I've been able to go out to the community through this publicly financed campaign model, where I have had to build a broad coalition even to qualify. I had to get 500 donors just to even qualify for the program. And now we're rounding the bend on 5,000 donations this election, which is an unheard of number for a municipal election like this. We have an opportunity to build a people's mayor's office. And that is something that we haven't seen, because if you look at the research, it's just been a few hundred people who've donated the bulk of the dollars to these elections year after year after year. And so building a publicly financed, community-powered campaign is really shaking shaking up the politics of the city, and it's making new ideas viable, so that once upon a time you maybe had the greatest longevity or the deepest pockets to be the most viable candidate. But now it really is about the ideas that I'm putting on the table and the unique coalitions that I will build and the relationships that I'll get to invest in with that open door policy, because I have to assume with that many donors, I don't know who everyone's name, right? And so I have to assume just about any Portlander I meet, whether it's my clerk at the food cart right there or the bartender down the block, they're probably potentially a donor. So I need to make sure that I'm keeping them happy and doing those donor relations that usually have just been a handful of influential people. So it's transformative. And I don't know that many Portlanders understand that. I don't know that they understand the dynamics of how campaigns are financed or what that means, but it really does mean that not a single special interest will have my ear, but that's really the people of Portland who will be able to come together and shape the future of the city, which is really important right now.